Welcome to the Savvy Dentist podcast with Dr. Jesse Green, the show where great dentistry meets great business. Listen in each week as we bring you an inspiring person who will share their story, ideas and business techniques to help you create a practice and a life you love. And now introducing your host, Dr. Jesse Green.
Hello everyone, it's Jesse Green here. Welcome back to SavvyDentist.com and to the Savvy Dentist podcast. It is great to have you here for another episode of the show. Now, as practice owners, we all understand the desire to become the CEO of our business, to move from having a practice to a company to an enterprise if we're going on that journey of creating a business that is firstly profitable, then scalable, and ultimately valuable. We know we've got to step into a CEO role. Now, my guest today is Brandy Mabra, and Brandy is excellent at helping healthcare practitioners make that transition. So on this episode, we talked a lot about how to make that journey, some of the pitfalls that are on that journey, how to overcome those obstacles, and of course, what to do when things don't quite go to plan. And Brandy is really knowledgeable, she's really wise, and she's had a lot of experience in the trenches and guiding other people through that journey themselves. Now, Brandy's got a website called savvyclover.com, and on that website, there's a business health check, which I'd encourage you to grab a hold of, to download and to complete, because it gives you an idea of where your practice is right now and what your next step is. So again, go and grab that from savvyclover.com. It'll be a useful tool for you, and I know that you'll get a lot out of it. In this episode as well, we're going to be talking about leadership challenges. We're going to be talking about how to develop other people in their roles. Lots and lots of really useful and practical things here. So as always, do have a pen and paper handy, because there's going to be some real pearls of wisdom that you're going to want to capture. Now, speaking of pearls of wisdoms and things you want to capture, I'm going to encourage you that if you're a practice owner who's motivated and driven, who wants to grow their practice, who wants to go on that journey of becoming a CEO to create an enterprise that is profitable and scalable and ultimately valuable, then come and join us in the Savvy Dentist Facebook group. It's totally free for practice owners, and we'd love to see you there. So head across to Facebook, search for Savvy Dentist Facebook group, and we'd love to invite you into that group there. It's going to give you some tools, some training, some resources to help you on your journey from becoming an operator in your practice to becoming a true business owner and an entrepreneur indeed as well. So enjoy that resource there for you. It's totally free. And let's get on to our conversation with Brandy. Here she is. Brandy Mabra, thank you so much for taking the time to come and join us all the way from North Carolina. It's great to have you on the podcast, and it is an ungodly hour of night for you. So thank you especially for sitting up late for this podcast. How's things today or tonight?
Yeah, tonight things are lovely, lovely. I'm excited to be here and just for us to have our conversation. And thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Anyone with the name Savvy in their website automatically, it gets a tick from me. And your website is savvyclover.com. So I feel like, we're kindred spirits. And for me, Savvy is about being street smart and being bright. And I know we're going to have a really great conversation about helping dentists and dental practice owners become bright and street smart as well. And before we get into that though, Brandy, I want to ask you a bit about your background, because it's quite an interesting background you've got. You work a lot with healthcare practitioners. You help them grow their teams and develop their businesses. I'm curious to understand, how did you find your way into that kind of work? What led you to that point in your life?
Oh, I have a long and winding road. So I actually come from a family of healthcare professionals. So my uncle is a dentist. My mother is an RN. My sister is in HR, but she works in OBGYN. So I could go on and on with grandmother and cousins and things. But essentially, I started out in cardiology, exercise physiology, and doing stress testings and things. And so that led to a practice management career. If you were to look me up online, you would find that I moved from Ohio to North Carolina. When I got to North Carolina, I ended up in a practice management role. And now I have 15 years worth of business management leadership experience building multi-million-dollar practices. And so it's this experience that I've now taken to my own business to be able to work with healthcare practitioners to help them have a strong foundation when it comes to their practice, making sure that they're owning their CEO role of their practice and empowering their team to help them be able to work less hours, to have a life that they love, to not be chained to their, to their desk and their practice, and being able to actually enjoy the life that they've really started their business to create.
Fantastic. Well, I think we're going to have a good chat about that, because that really resonates with our audience. I wanted to ask you a bit about the stages of growth of a business, because you've been in those practices that have grown. You've seen the different stages. I'm curious to ask you whether you see patterns there, whether you see, things that translate from one practice to another, or indeed one type of healthcare to another. So in terms of the growth cycle or the growth phases of a business, what have you observed in that space? And I guess where I'm going with that is, if we're talking about the practice owner stepping into the CEO role, how do they need to evolve as that practice continues to grow?
Yeah, I think in the beginning stages, it always makes sense that you're kind of the one doing a lot of the things. But at some point in time, the business definitely outgrows that. So one of the things I find is you'll hire maybe another provider. You might even have an administrative, someone to help you. But at some point in time, you have to be able to step into that CEO role so you can oversee the business, not work just in the business. And that transition comes sometimes quicker than what the owner anticipates. And then they're, working all the hours, coming in the early mornings, the late nights, the weekends, keeping so many things on their plate. They lose track of what's happening, maybe even how much money's coming in, or billing, or, the fact of what the team is doing or not doing, all of those things. But the different stages is recognizing, once you start to get full, then to definitely pay attention to what's happening and how you're doing things, and looking at operational processes. And then once you're hiring, paying attention to, how you're leading the team. How are you showing up as a leader of the practice? How does it feel to delegate? How does it feel once you're passing things over? Are you taking it back? Once the practice outgrows you, and your skill set, then it's definitely important to realize that you are now a company, an entity, and definitely understanding that you need to have some additional skill sets to set you up for success, which is what I love about what you do, because you help with that. So yeah, but it's definitely, it can be challenging, but there's definitely different phases to it too.
You've given me a rich tapestry of areas to explore there. So we might try and pick one or two of those to explore in no particular order, and come back for the rest as well. But you did speak about starting off being on the tools, and then filling up, and then really, deciding at what stage do I need to either hire additional help, or maybe do I redefine my role as dentist. And I feel like I can speak to that. I can't speak to you deal with a whole lot of different healthcare providers as well as dentists, but I imagine there's some similarities. Is, as dentists, we tend to be control freaks. I say that kind of lowering my voice as though it's like a secret, like no one else would know it. But yes, we are. We're control freaks. So we like things done a very particular way. Most dentists I know are very type A personalities. They're very precise. They're very particular. They like things a particular way. And so handing things over is often a challenge. Intellectually, it makes perfect sense. We all get it. Yes, I'll delegate this to so-and-so. But the moment something goes awry, we do tend to step in and go, oh, we can't have that, and we take it back. And inadvertently, we disempower our team by doing that, because they know when you delegate something, if they don't get it right, we're going to take it back. I wanted just to ask you a bit about, how do we overcome our perfectionistic nature? How do we be okay with delegating and being outcome focused rather than having everything just so? And what have you observed and that's been helpful for people to get through that?
Yeah, I love that. And dentists are not alone. Yeah, you have a lot of company in that area where, let me try it. Nope, didn't work out. So let me just keep it because I'm the only one who can do it, right?
Yeah, and we know that's a trap.
Yes. So one of the things I always say is to pay attention if that's how you're showing up, and with that type A personality, then setting your team up for success. So instead of just giving something, making sure that the instructions are there, making sure that follow-up is part of the process, due dates, making sure that even just explaining back, do you understand exactly what's required? All of those things to set the team up for success before the delegation happens. And then understanding that sometimes 80% of the job being done is better than you doing it 100%, right?
Yeah.
And so just having that expectation of knowing they're going to make mistakes, they're going to mess up, and then thinking about what is the best thing that can happen if I delegate this, and what is the worst thing that can happen when I delegate this, and oftentimes the worst case scenario is sometimes, well, if I delegate it, they mess up, maybe I might lose a patient, or, something might end up getting messed up to where it's my reputation on the line. But oftentimes, even those things might be fixable. If that's the fear, then what can you do to make sure that you're setting the team up for success to where that doesn't happen? And then thinking about what's the best case scenario if I do get this off my desk. Am I going to be able to go home and play with my kids? Am I going to be able to take a vacation? Am I going to be able to actually see what's happening with my business? Am I going to be able to make more money? So just really getting clear on what is the fear behind of wanting to have the control, and then making sure that you're setting the team up for success, and then also thinking about what's the benefits if I actually get this off my desk. So
what I was honed in on there was what's the best case, what's the worst case scenario, and perhaps doing some risk mitigation around that worst case scenario and being clear about, if the what hits the fan, then I can do this, that, and the other to
yes.
Mitigate that. As the practice grows, obviously our mindset is going to shift. We're going to be thinking differently about different things at different stages of growth. What sort of upgrading or evolution or changes in mindset particularly have you noticed that have been helpful for people to make that transition? What have your successful clients done? What have you observed in practice that really allows people to make that leap?
Yeah, there's a couple of different things. They realize that they either have the skill set that they need to take the practice to the next level, or they realize that their team might need some additional training or some additional love in order to go with them, or they're having to just make changes that's going to allow for them to get to the next level. So I just recently had a client, same thing, like, she's getting ready to upscale her practice. And so some of the conversation has been, are you prepared for what you're asking for? That means mindset, that means, operationally, that means team-wise. Do you have who you need on your dream team? She's been able to do some promotions, but even within the promotions, those people need some additional training, some additional help in order to go with her where she needs to go. And for herself, she doesn't have the CEO skill set. So that's obviously why we're working together, just to make sure that she's set up for success, as she's scaling her practice. So I think the mindset shift is to realize that you don't necessarily know all the answers. That's okay. You know your craft. And so when it comes to the business side of things, you might need some help. When it comes to the team leadership side, you might need some help. But being accepting of that and being in a place of wanting to learn that is definitely part of the mindset shift, and just realizing, change can be hard, but it's definitely doable, especially if you're working towards a goal of having the practice run without you.
Again, lots of things I can talk about here. You're giving me so many good topics to really dive into, and I feel like I could be here for a week talking to you. But let's just start with something that you said relatively explicitly, but I'll just kind of rephrase it in my language, and that is, we're kind of, as we're scaling our practice, we're building a company, not just a practice. We're taking on that. And I wanted just to come back to that for a second, because I think that's a really important mindset. Because if we think about a company versus a small dental practice, we start to expand our vision, we start to expand our thinking. And then as we're starting to apply that expansive thinking to a team structure, we're going to be building leadership teams. Now, you've had plenty of experience as a practice manager, and in practice management. And I imagine in some of those larger practices that you helped scale, you had to build leadership teams beyond just having your solitary practice manager. And so what I would like to just start the conversation about is building out a leadership team, what that looks like, who's taking care of operations, who's taking care of marketing, who's taking care of whatever. What does that look like in your world where you're going, okay, I've now had my practice manager and they've been great. Now my business is starting to scale. I've got to build in other leaders into this structure. What's that look like?
You have your practice manager, and then thinking about, do you need to promote that practice manager, essentially, or office manager to the next level? So that might look like a director of operations. It might look like a COO or a chief operating officer, just to make sure that you have that plan. and that filter. The other part of it, just to tap into marketing, do you need a marketing coordinator? Do you need a marketing director? Essentially, when you're getting into the multi-million-dollar, practice and company, then yes, you need a marketing director. You need a director of operations or someone who has a higher level of leadership capability to help you from even an HR perspective. So one of the clients that I was working with earlier today, we're setting up her HR structure. So making sure that she's set up for success from that perspective, especially as you have more team, is the business culture on point? Do they have the training that they need? Evaluations, is that happening consistently? Is there the compliance pieces there? That becomes important. IT, if you have with computers and technology and, EMR systems, all of the things start to become more important, especially as part of the leadership team that you're going to have in place. Just to set you up for success as the CEO, for sure.
If we're talking about promoting your practice manager potentially to an operations manager or a COO or whatever role that is, do they then manage the other people, say the marketing coordinator? In your world, is that how that works? You 2IC is then managing the rest of the leadership team. In our world, that's what I would talk about. Just you've got your 2IC, you've got your business owner, your 2IC, then beneath that you've got a leadership team like heads of department kind of thing, without wanting to sound too formal and too siloed. What I wanted to ask you about is accountability structures and processes and the difference between, someone being in a role with a title versus achieving an outcome. Can you just give me your thoughts, please, around how to ensure accountability? Because as we go through that growth phase, at least in my experience, there can be a case of we're growing quickly, we throw bodies at the problem, but we're not necessarily achieving outcomes. So how do we maintain high levels of accountability as we move through?
Oh, absolutely. You do that through definitely policy and procedures, standard operating procedures, job descriptions, KPIs, who is responsible for what. And to go back to the original statement that you had said, who is responsible for in regards to the leadership team, it's been different at different practices depending on the size. Sometimes it's a marketing director that reports directly to the CEO. Sometimes it's the marketing director that reports to the operations. It just depends on what works for the practice. Also, just the clinical area of focus, making sure that that's sound. One of the things that I find is making sure that from the clinical policy and procedures, clinical guidelines, all of those things are on paper, written down, not just in the practice owner's head, just depending on what that staffing model looks like too. So I think just documenting exactly how the business needs to run and knowing that it's always going to be fluid is so important. Because one of the things I find is especially with the owner, they should know what I think. They should know exactly how I practice. They should know how, to check in a certain patient. They should know how to answer the phone. They should know how to enter the information into the computer, set up an appointment, all of those things. But if it's not documented, everybody learns differently. Everybody does things a different way and what makes sense for them. So you want to make sure that you're setting yourself up for success, the practice up for success, and definitely the team up for success too.
Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that. And of course, that's going to require training of your team members as well. And now you've got your resources there to be able to do that. One of the philosophies we have here at Savvy Dentists is that each practice needs to see themselves as a training institution. In other words, how well they can recruit good people, onboard, train, and retain good people is going to be critical to their growth. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about training and onboarding and so on, just into the specifics a little bit for a second. Because again, the thing I really like about you, Brandy, is you've got the high-level strategic overview, but you've also got the technical know-how to get into the weeds, right? And so just for a minute, I just want to get into the weeds and we'll come back up and be a bit more strategic. But from a training point of view and an onboarding first and then training point of view, what do you see as being best practice? What works well? What are the pitfalls that you see that people make mistakes with routinely, and how do you overcome those?
Yes, the onboarding piece is so important because it needs to be structured and organized. It's not that, Susie's first day is today. Susie, this is the person who's going to be training you. And by the end of the day, Susie's training has gone out the window because it's gotten busy and we needed Susie to help. And so now Susie's been trained, trial by fire.
Yeah.
And now Susie's had a different, horrible experience and wants to quit the next day.
Yeah.
So taking the time and having a well thought out training schedule, paying attention to who the person is actually working with. Are they working with the best performer? Someone who's going to teach them well, who is able to explain things, and is going to give the person the best experience. And because at the end of the day, yes, you're interviewing the person, that you've hired the person, but in the first 90 days, they're still evaluating you and you're evaluating them. So you want to make sure that it's a good fit. So I love what you said about training. There should be lots of training. There should be, this is how you work this system. This is how you're working with this patient. This is, what our business culture is. This is what our mission is. This is what our vision is. This is where you can find additional information. This is where our hub for where everything is housed. So if you have questions, if we're not available, this is where you can find this. Just making sure that it's there and set up for their success, because that's going to be a game changer. A lot of times people, they will start, they might not even say anything. And then next thing you know, they're putting in their notice and you have no idea why, and so then you're back, starting over and having to rehire, and it becomes a revolving door of help. So a well thought out onboarding process is definitely important.
In terms of resourcing in a practical level, how do you resource that? Do you have a dedicated trainer in the practice? Do you have, for individual roles, would you identify this is the person that trains for front desk training, this is the person that trains for dental assistant training in our world, so on and so forth? Do you kind of get that specific with it, or do you kind of have a trainer, or indeed just who happens to be on the floor on any given day?
Yeah, I've seen all of it, literally. And so I've had where there's training teams that come in and specifically, work with individuals as almost like where they're hands off, like you can't touch this person, just depending on the size of the practice. But also I've seen where there is key higher performers that you always want to make sure that they're the ones who are training the team. If you don't have a higher performer, then that tells me a lot about your team, and you need to maybe go back and reevaluate, who you've hired. But if you're in a place where it's maybe in the beginning stages and you're kind of at the mercy of who you've already hired and being able to show them what the job entails. However, I do feel that the practice owner needs to be involved. As the practice does grow, you get more leadership, you hire more folks, then definitely having dedicated trainers or people who you've identified, that can train well, can make sure that people understand and is going to provide a good experience is important. So it just depends at the stage of business and understanding, work with what you got, and then become more strategic as you're growing. Definitely.
Really what I wanted to talk to you about today, and again, there's a heap of things, but is for the practice owner to step into that CEO role. And again, coming back to the concept of building a company, not a practice, and stepping up into that CEO role. We've kind of touched on the mindset piece already, but what about the skill set? What sort of skills do you think a business owner needs to develop as they go through that process?
I would say definitely understanding that as you're stepping into that CEO role, you're paying attention to the vision of where the company is moving towards, and taking yourself outside of the day-to-day operations, essentially, but still having a good pulse on what's happening. So it's not that, now I'm officially in my CEO role and everybody's doing everything for me. I have no idea. But setting yourself up for success and paying attention to where are you moving towards. If you have that vision, that mission, is everything that's happening in the practice still moving towards that mission, still moving toward that vision. A lot of times it's expanding the brand, expanding, the impact. If that's where you want to be, if you want to maybe you want to do like a global impact. Maybe you want to have more of a community impact, understanding exactly where your place is in the marketplace and stepping into that fully, and then making sure that the team is there to support you. And so it becomes more vision, mission, team development, and if there's maybe some certain things that you want to keep skill-wise, and maybe you're doing some of that limitly, but yeah, it's more or less just paying attention to where the company is moving towards and less in the weeds of the practice.
As you're talking, I'm thinking of a particular client I worked with. She's very successful, and when we first started working together, she had a very traditional practice where she was doing lots of dentistry, and she made pretty decent money, but her vision was to own a company, not a practice. And certainly, she was able to achieve that. She made a lot more money. She was working only a handful of days a year clinically, and that was by choice. And I wanted to ask you, the reason I'm bringing this up is because this particular practice owner enjoyed this newfound time freedom to such an extent, this is before COVID, that she went traveling around the world and kind of became the absentee owner in a sense, right? We were talking about what, in my experience, I thought that was a bit of a strategic error. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about what happens when all of a sudden you go, hang on, I don't need to be the revenue generator. I don't need to be the person on the shop floor in the practice drilling and filling and billing. What I wanted to ask you about is how to manage that transition, because there's a temptation to do what this friend of mine did. And again, she figured it out, and she's smart and intelligent, and she kind of figured out that her role was kind of walking the floor and making sure the culture was there and doing all that sort of stuff. So she's smart. She figured it out. But how do you resist that temptation to suddenly go, woohoo, yeah, like, I'm off for a while.
I'm free.
Yeah, exactly. Here I am sipping pina coladas in wherever I am, right? How do you manage that?
It's balance. I always say to go back to where do you want the practice to go? Because at some point too, I know that there's owners who want to get to the point of selling. Yeah. So, if that's the goal and you want to go and fully sip Mai Tais on the beach, have at it, Yeah. Have at it. But however, if you are still like, this is my company, keeping a pulse on things and having the days where you're there, maybe you're not there 5 days, but you can have a balance of the days that you are there to make sure that things are running accordingly, that you're still there for your team. They know exactly how to reach you. A client of mine is very similar. Except for her, it was some medical things that had happened and she had stepped away. And when she came back, she was like, oh, wow, I didn't realize how much I was needed still. Yeah. I think it's just establishing the balance of everything. And then also too, asking the team, what do you need from me in order to make sure that things are running smoothly and that they're set up for success, because you might be able to take a month off. Essentially, you can definitely do that. I've seen practice owners do that. Yeah. But at the same time, there's still communication happening, or how to get in touch with me, or there's still check-ins, where you can definitely have the best of both worlds, I guess is what I'm trying to say. For
me, I kind of feel like if you want to own a business, there's a responsibility that comes with owning a business or running a company, and part of that responsibility is leading the team. And if you want to fully sit on the beach and drink the Mai Tais or the pina coladas, and obviously preparing for an exit is that as well. I wanted to ask you a bit about pitfalls, obstacles, challenges, again, things that you see that business owners might stumble over on their journey to CEO. What are the common things that you think trip people up? And again, what would be the remedies for those?
Yeah, one of the things that I see is just the kindness. When you get into the healthcare industry, we're all service-based, right? We want to help people. We want to make sure that people are okay, that they're well. And so sometimes, I hate to say to the detriment of that, when it comes to owning the CEO role, you have to make tough decisions. You're now paying attention to the money. You're having to maybe fire somebody or let someone go or do layoffs, especially with everything that's happened with the pandemic. And that can be very challenging, especially when you're heart-centered. And so there is a shift in that where you realize that I have to make sure that the business is healthy, that, the practice is thriving, so that way we can continue to be here to serve, the patients, that we can continue to be able to serve the community. And that can be, a blessing and a curse. So I find that that's probably one of the most challenging things. Also, just having sometimes difficult conversations and wanting to shy away from having some of those more difficult conversations. It's always the easier thing to, hey, good morning, how are you? It's something completely different to say, I'm sorry, I have to let you go today.
Yeah, it's the not fun part of the job, but it's the necessary part of the job, and it is the responsibility that comes with it. So What I wanted to ask you is about managing that heart center and that head center. All of us that work in healthcare emphasize the care part on the end of that word. Transitioning from caring for patients to caring for team to caring for the business. And really, it's all about care. It's just perhaps where we shift our focus a little bit about where we place that care. And in terms of the CEO taking care of the business and the stakeholders, obviously one of the big challenges then is, as you've articulated, making those tough decisions, having to make those calls. Where else do you see that tension exists that could trip up a business owner?
Oh, well, we're talking about care. So you talked about care for patients, care for team, care for business, definitely care for yourself as the practice owner, and making sure that you're in the best space possible, making sure that you're taking care of yourself so that way you can show up more powerful as, to others is one of the things that I see, just the neglect, because the business is the business, the team is the team, the patients, and then the owner gets put on the back burner essentially. And that makes it more challenging when you do have to show up and make tougher decisions or, participate in the unsexy side of being a CEO is what I like to call it. But when you're taking care of yourself, making sure that you're in a good space, making sure that you have your team of support for you as the CEO. And when I say that, I mean more of if there is a coach that you need or a therapist that you need or a community that you need in order to make sure that you're okay, then that makes it easier when you do have to show up to make some of those harder decisions because you're not feeling lonely and you aren't coming from a place of, again, that heart-centered, and now you're putting that attention that you need essentially onto the team and into the patients and to the practice. And it helps you be able to show up as a stronger leader if you're supported outside of the business.
I'm really glad you raised that, Brandy, because I say in our business that the greatest risk to our business, or one of the greatest risks, is me, which sounds like a really self-deprecating, almost derogatory comment, but I don't mean it in that sense. What I mean is that if I'm not well rested, if I'm not looking after myself, and I've got some tendencies to neglect myself from time to time as well. So I've two hands in the air, Mm-hmm. But I also know that when I do that, I'm not as resourceful as I could be. I go into those conversations, at the risk of me going into those difficult conversations is we get unintended outcomes. When you're tired, your patience is not what it normally would be, or perhaps you're not thinking as rationally as you might otherwise. So I really appreciate that. And I see that self-care piece as a almost like a hard-headed business decision in the sense that it's not just about I look after myself and aren't we nice? There's a commercial imperative for me to look after me and for you to look after you in your business and for the listeners to look after themselves in their business. There's a real commercial imperative. It's not just touchy-feely stuff, yeah? Is that fair?
Absolutely. Even for myself, I work with a high-performance coach. And that is by design because I am one too that can put myself on the back burner, and put my team ahead, my family, my clients, everything. And so at the end of the day, you don't want to get into a place where you resent, what you're building and what you're doing, and because you've put yourself last. So I absolutely wholeheartedly agree with everything that you're saying.
Every quarter, I take a week away. It's not a vacation or it's not a holiday. It's a week where I just go to the ocean. It starts off with a couple of days of not much, but then interestingly, my creativity comes back. My ability to think strategically blossoms and flourishes. So every quarter I do that. My wife is so excited. She normally packs my bags for me. So she's like, go, see you later. See you when you come back. And I think the reason I bring that up is not because people should go and do that necessarily. They can if they want to, but having that opportunity to decompress. How do you do that in your world, Brady? How do you decompress? What strategies do you have or what things do you suggest for others to decompress? Yes,
I love that. If you follow me, then you'll hear me say CEO breaks. And I'm a big advocate of CEO breaks. And that is taking the time to do that, to get your creativity back, to turn things off. So for me, I love to travel. I was just recently in Bora Bora, which was amazing. Earlier this year, I went to Egypt. There's sometimes where I'm just staying at my house, resting and doing a stay vacation type thing, honoring boundaries, especially with when it comes to my phone, trying to make sure outside of doing, podcast interviews late at night, normally making sure I am going to bed on time. Yeah. But I definitely recommend putting that as part of your calendar, scheduling it. That's what I do with my clients is if they're talking about, well, I think I want to take some time off. Great. Schedule it. Let's go ahead and put it in the calendar. So that way it's there and then we can strategize around it in order to make sure that it happens. So I love it.
Brandy, if you were having a conversation in a one-to-one situation with a dentist or a healthcare provider and they said to you, Brandy, here's my situation. I've got a good practice. We've got good cash flow. We've got good patient flow. I've got a nice team. I love my team. They're great. I'm just feeling a bit stressed and pulled in 100 different directions. I'm still doing a lot of clinical work. I'm still trying to get out of the mire. What would you suggest as the first significant step to take in that situation for someone ready to make that transition to scaling?
Yeah, get really clear on what you're doing. So it's one thing to say that I'm doing all the things or I'm doing the clinical work or I'm kind of in the weeds of the business. What exactly are you doing and how many hours are you spending on what? Because if you get that down, so I always recommend time tracking, but if you get really clear on what you're doing, then we have an opportunity to see what we need to delegate. So if it's the the clinical part of it, then is it, we need to hire another provider to come in. If it's more admin things that you're working on, okay, well, what can we get off your plate? And we need to hire an admin person to help with these things. So that way we can transition you into that true CEO role. So it starts with clarity first of what exactly are you doing and taking the time to pay attention to what you're working on and not just saying, well, I'm doing all these things, I'm busy, and getting really clear on what are you busy doing. So that's one of the things that I always recommend.
Okay, cool. I think that's a really good first step. So ladies and gents, if you are listening to this podcast, and I'm going to encourage you to go back and listen to that section that Brandy just mentioned for a few times over. Track your activities, get specific about your activities, think about where you're spending your time, how you're spending your time, what can you delegate, what can you stop doing altogether. Maybe there's some automations that you could have in place as well. So there's some really good things there. I think it's also really good to take stock of your practice and to do a health check on your practice. And if you do go to Brandy's website, which is called savvyclover.com, and you go to the homepage there, if you scroll down, you'll find the business health checklist. And that's going to give you 16 activities. They're really going to help you drive the excellence and growth and profit of your practice. And I'd really encourage you to go through that exercise, because what that does, it gives you clarity. And clarity allows for better decision making. And it's going to give you insights into what to focus on first. What's your next best step to take? And I think a health check like that, a time audit like Brandy has just suggested, are all really important keys to be able to figure out where you are, where you want to get to, and what are the first 2 or 3 steps to do that. So I think there's some good resources there. Brandy, just I'm mindful of the time, and you've been really generous. But we've spoken a bit about CEOs and becoming the CEO of your company, transitioning from a practice to a company, transitioning from a practitioner to a CEO. I wanted to ask you, who are some of the CEOs that you admire? So who are some of the CEOs that you really look up to? And what is it about them that you admire and respect?
Yeah, there was a CEO that I worked with, and he had actually sold his practice, and I was hired to help post, acquisition and to help with restructure and growth and things. And one of the things that I loved about him was just the freedom that he had created. He was really, had gotten to a space where he was able to travel. He was, very attached to what he had built. But just when he would walk in, it was just free, and just very much attentive to what he needed, what he didn't need it. He was still tentative to the team. And I just really respected that about him. So I would say that that's probably one of the best examples that I can definitely think of. Just strong leadership. Yeah.
Strong leadership. Yeah, cool. I think it's probably fair that we let you have a bit of a sleep and get back to a normal circadian rhythm. But I want to say thank you so much for coming and hanging out on our podcast. You've been a really generous guest and a really knowledgeable guest as well. And I really appreciate the wisdom and the insights you've shared. So from all of us here at Savvy Dentist, thank you so much for coming onto the program.
No, thank you so much for having me. This was fun. This was a really great way to spend my night. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Brandy.
Thank you for listening to the Savvy Dentist podcast. For more episodes, go to drjessiegreen.com/savvydentist. And to discover how to build a high-performance dental practice, visit drjessiegreen.com and download the free report.